All right, welcome back. So, this is our week one Fireside Chat. Now, ironically, I do have a fireplace over there that is going right now, but I cannot maneuver the camera to get it in screen. So, um, I have a few things I want to cover, and let's start out. So, first of all, I included a folder during the first week, and it's Timelines of Inclusion. It does have timelines produced by previous students. There are 3 timelines in there. One has to actually do with the timelines of ADA, and I think that's a very intriguing timeline to look at. But typically what happens, we get very narrow when we think about discrimination and in schools. We think about, the 60s and 70s and the changes for racial integration, 70s, integrating students with disabilities. But really, we've had efforts as a country, since over the last 200 years, and those are denoted within these timelines. And again, just for a perspective, that there's been a lot that's been done beyond just the last 40 years. And not that they were always probably, we would look at it today and say, boy, we wouldn't do something like that, like create a institution such as, if you look online, Pennhurst, for, people with mental health disorders 100 years ago and things like that. But at the time, people thought this was a really good thing that they were doing. So you have to look at the intentions at the time. But I think that, again, that's interesting to look at. I want to share a personal story, and I remember when I was in, maybe 4th grade, 3rd, 4th grade, somewhere around there. So I attended a school that literally was built in the 1880s. It was 4 stories tall, it was red brick, and no elevator, and it had many, many steps, and some of them actually were wooden staircases. Wow, amazing. Tore it down the year I graduated. It was a K-8 building, so I graduated, went to high school, and there's a brand new school for the kids after that. A little bit envious because it had a huge gym with glass backboards, and we were playing in a gym that basically had a concrete floor and, old metal backboards and a scoreboard that didn't work. But anyway, this building, first of all, it wasn't ADA accessible, but I want to talk about something that I remember very clearly. So I had a friend, John, and one day, John started to disappear from class, and I never really knew why. And there was something that happened that coincided with that. So out in back of the school, there was a yellow mobile home that was moved in and parked, permanently kind of put there, had steps and everything, but right outside the back door, this yellow mobile home. Nobody knew what it was. Didn't have any sign on it, nothing. So, we go back and as kids, we have no idea really what this building is. No one said anything. So pretty soon, John, and I'm sure there were others, but John would disappear for hours at a time, be out of class. And then he'd come back. He'd have stickers. And I was a good friend of his, so he'd give me some of the stickers that he had. I never knew where he got them from, but eventually, years later, I learned that was the special education area for the school. So students with disabilities were served in complete pullout within that yellow mobile home. Then when the new school was built, they did have, a special resource, rooms that were built right within a center quad and surrounded by classrooms and a sensory room. And even today, now there'd be so much that would evolve, beyond that. But the thing was, nobody knew. I mean, we didn't have disability awareness, whether or not that was, non-discrimination, pupil discrimination. It's hard to say at the time. But I mean, I do feel because it was just a sole pull-out model. It didn't give the students a chance to stay with their peers for a lot of academic instruction and to also have any type of push-in services. So just going back to that, it's something that sticks out in my mind of that yellow mobile home being brought up. And then if you had to go to that mobile home for some of your classes, what that must have felt like. And again, the efforts or the lack of efforts to kind of make students aware of what that was is a big mystery. We have a couple things happening right now. One is No Child Left Behind pretty much got scrapped for every student or every child succeeds or something to that effect. But we still have some, we have what I call two solar systems on a collision course. So the Milky Way and the Andromeda. So what's happening right now is they're coming together and they will collide. So unfortunately, this will happen much sooner than the billions of years, which that's actually going to happen. And what happens is the NCLB, or now the Every Child Succeeds legislation, does have the expectations for all children to graduate and for a certain high level of inclusion. And what it really does is it kind of starts to butt heads with IDEA, the Individuals with Disability Education Act, and IDEA's requirement of a least restrictive environment. So the NCLB side is saying, well, no, students need to be in the classroom, they need to graduate, and IDEA is saying, hey, wait a minute, we have to meet students where they're at and put together a range of services for them, which might be a full pull-out program. It could be at a different location. We might have the student attend a community-based program because of the level of their needs. So that needs to be on the table. When people talk about full inclusion, I kind of cringe a little bit because there is no such thing as full inclusion. You can say you're a full inclusion district, but you're really not. Because you still, let's say you have a student with severe, medical needs or cognitive disabilities, you still have a range of services that you're going to provide throughout that child's day. That child is not going to be with their same age peers 100% of the time receiving the same curriculum and the same instruction. So what's actually happening is you're mixing up the terms mainstreaming and inclusion. When we get to there's an article by WEAC that kind of describes those two, and they are different. People use them to be synonymous, and they're not. But anyway, this collision is happening, and it does have real implications for pupil services and then also discrimination, because if you're under, if you're saying all students, every student has to be included in the classroom, that might come at a sacrifice of having some students receive the services that they need, which might be in a setting that's other than that classroom. Now, every discussion should start with the mainstream classroom. Every IEP discussion should say, we want the student to be in the mainstream classroom. What accommodations can we provide? And then if that's not going to be successful, okay, what's the next level down? Meaning, can we have some push-in services, or does the student have an hour a day when they're going to be in a pull-out setting for whatever, or it doesn't even get to the point where we need to contract for some mental health services outside of school that then the student will attend for part of their day or whatever. But every discussion, though, every IEP discussion needs to begin with that child being fully included in the classroom. And then if that's not possible, work it down from there. Too many meetings don't start at that point. They start at the point of, here's what we've got to do with the student, and then here's what they can do to earn their way back into the regular ed classroom, which you need to have that plan in place of having that consideration. But your first discussion should always be as if that student is going to be in that classroom. So in the 2000s, we saw a skyrocket in cases of autism. Whether that was better diagnosis or just more kids with autism, I'm not sure, but that definitely, was there for prevalence and DPI reporting. Now we're seeing OHI just take off. And why is that? It's because OHI is a catch-all. The DPI does not have, where autism is identifiable. It doesn't have depression. It doesn't have anxiety. It doesn't have bipolar. So all of those, which are medical diagnoses, those typically will fall under OHI, or they'll fall under a 504 plan. But you're seeing a OHI become kind of this huge net to catch all of these diagnoses. And I'm going to just grab a sip of coffee. Again, it's a kind of low humidity. Need to keep the vocal cords, keep them going. So, but anyway, right now what we're seeing is a skyrocket in OHI, particularly in the diagnosis of anxiety. Anxiety is the number one diagnosis for youth. So by far, and it's a hockey stick. It's taken right off. And we're seeing more and more, prescriptions for kids. I remember when I was in school, a K-8 building, literally probably all the meds for the school were kept in one locked little slide-out drawer that the secretary had. When I left, we had gun cases, that would be secured because people, will break into schools looking for Ritalin and Lazapram and, lithium and other things which are now, quite commonly prescribed to kids. So it's become almost a pseudo pharmacy, and some of these meds, street value are worth thousands. So we're seeing a big change with kids, more mental health needs. I've interviewed a lot of principals in my dissertation work just recently, and boy, everybody says that. And I know that too. I mean, I've seen that firsthand, but just the number of mental health needs kids have, and then also that, families are presenting with. So what you need to be, I guess, very creative too when you're working with students with anxiety and some conditions that maybe you haven't worked with a lot before, or your staff hasn't worked with. You need to think outside the box and making sure that you're not discriminating against that student because of that disability. And I want to give a couple examples. One is a student that had a high anxiety level diagnosis of an anxiety disorder. She was actually Skyped into school from her home, so set up a situation where she could have a monitor and see what was happening in her classroom, and then participated by Skype, and then eventually was brought to the school for 20 minutes, and then more and more was mainstreamed into the school. So that sounds extreme, but actually that was what needed to happen. We worked with the medical provider in that case too. I worked with a mother a year ago, and she had sought me out as I had known her. She was a student that I had in a class a number of years ago. She was a teacher, but her daughter had PTSD, and then also cumulative stress disorder, which is a new diagnosis, and a few other pretty intense mental health needs. And the parent that contacted me, and I don't serve in the role of an advocate for parents and things like that. I'll try to connect them up with the resources, and of course try to get them to have a positive conversation with the principal and with the school, and to work things out. But what this parent was saying is the school just doesn't know how to work with PTSD, and my daughter's not getting the services, and we need access to the sensory room and all this other stuff, and which those elements might have been accurate. And what I said is, you need to make a list and bring that to the principal and maybe the student services director and say, here's my concerns. Can you talk about how staff are being educated as to serving students who come in with PTSD, or how that can be done, and maybe how I can help to do that if I can come in and talk. Typically I'm kind of leery about parents doing that, but if the parents know an outside resource, their parents in school can work together on finding someone to come in and to talk about that, or to do an in-service. And then also, looking at the, working with the physician and checking physician recommendations. For example, does it benefit for the child to have access to the sensory room, certain times of day or whatever. But we're seeing also students that are on some pretty intense medications, and the parent might say, my child, because of this med, they have this, reaction, and so, XYZ needs to be done at school or whatnot. So those things are hard to navigate. People get defensive. They think school's not doing enough. They want to bring in an advocate or a lawyer. And the best thing as a student services director is just say, whoa, let me understand where you're coming from, and here's where we're at. Here's what we've done. Of course, we want to, have a positive experience for your child and for you, and to see what can be done. And also to be realistic. I mean, there might be some requests out there which just aren't going to make sense. For example, a parent comes in and says, you can never restrain my child, ever. And the child is taking off and running toward a busy road. Of course, I mean, you're going to restrain the child for the child's safety. So, but we are seeing OHI, really take off. So look at your OHI numbers at your school. Try to break that down. What is constituting OHI? And this is going to become an issue for the DPI very fast, of trying to figure out whether they're going to put in medical diagnoses, which then would align with what's called ICD-10 codes. That's what medical codes are for things such as anxiety and depression and so forth. Or if they're going to break it into other categories or just leave it under OHI. But it is getting to be very, very complicated, because it's not like you have cognitive behavioral therapists on staff who are going to work with a student that presents with anxiety disorder. So it's, again, something to be very aware of. That's where I see the trend in special education. I say special education director, it's really more of a medical services director, and I've had many of my peers agree to that. That look at this from a medical model. So make sure that you're not tracking students. This has happened to a few districts, and it makes the news. A few districts in Wisconsin not too long ago. Student is diagnosed with a cognitive disability, and then you say, okay, they're in our CD program, and here's their schedule. You can't do that. You have to have an IEP, look at all of the placement options, for that child, and then determine the placement. The diagnosis does not equal the placement. And don't get in, never do that, never create a document that indicates that. That's simply not the case. When you do have your IEPs, you want to make sure that you're denoting multiple options that were considered for placement and not just one. That is something the DPI would look at during a self-eval when they came on site, did an assessment, or Office of Civil Rights complaint. You always want to make sure that you are documenting that you have considered multiple placements, and then also like why XY placements weren't deemed to be in the best interest of the child. So I am asking you to share your district special ed prevalence numbers this week. You can pull those off your October 1, I believe it's October 1, but it's used to be called a third Friday count or whatever, but you can get that from your special ed director or your superintendent or whatever, but your school is required to submit that to DPI. Don't pull it off DPI website, because it's not going to be there for this year. I mean, previous years will be there, but not this year. So you'll have those numbers, and it's, what percentage of students have autism, what percentage have learning disabilities and speech language disabilities, so forth. Produce those numbers and then give some feedback. Look at that and say, this looks okay, this looks high to me, and this surprised me, or maybe look through if you want some historical data. This is trending in a certain direction. Talk to your student services director, ask their thought about it, if they have any concerns, or also what the impact of RTI is. Are you all of a sudden seeing LD numbers drop? But again, my guess is you're probably going to see that offset by OHI numbers going up. But take a look at what your prevalence numbers are. Now, roughly in the state, about 13% of students are identified as having a disability. So if your district has like 20% students identified with a disability, you'll want to start asking some questions. Why? Why is that? So maybe that's just the way that it is in your district, but typically it's about 13%. You'll also see districts that might have 5%. You'll want to ask, why is that? And maybe they're not identifying students with disabilities. Instead, they're putting them into some special either remedial or whatever programs that they have, just to keep that percentage low. And I have seen districts do that for various reasons. Some of it is public perception and whatever, but just just look at those numbers and post them and give some feedback and look at other people's numbers. So disproportionality. If your district has been identified as disproportionate in identifying students with special needs by race, for example, about 35 districts in Wisconsin were, for example, saying African American student in your district is 7 times more likely to be identified EBD than a white student. That typically, around the Madison area, the schools around there, you'll have been identified as disproportionate. You kind of see that happen around like a Madison or Milwaukee, around those areas. The schools, the outliers, tend to be identified with disproportionate identification. So look at the referral process and talk to your special ed director, talk to staff if you have that going on. And then also what your plans are, what's been done to try to decrease disproportionate identification of students with disabilities. So that can be a really slippery slope. So that's something you want to really pay attention to as a special ed director. So I do have an article posted, Working with Third Parties. I wrote that after an experience I had as a director, and let me share that with you. It was about, I'm going to grab some coffee here. So a little bit about the picture and back me with the 4 me's in different colors. That was done by a student at an alternative school that I oversaw maybe around 2007. So it's a really cool piece. It means a lot to me. A little piece of artwork up above. On the other side here with the different colors right over there above the guitar. So that was actually done by a man with intellectual disability who was institutionalized for 60 years, and his ability, his incredible art skills weren't discovered until he was well into his 60s. And I got to meet him, and I bought that piece of artwork from him. And he now goes and has shows and has a website and things like that. But no one knew that he had that talent, so very meaningful. So, and the guitar is from my godfather, who was actually rode in the rodeo in New Mexico when he was a kid. So, but so working with third parties. When I was a special ed director, one of start of the year, a while back, probably 5-6 days in, one of my staff called from an elementary school and said, I'm frustrated because this person that is coming in and working with Tommy is telling me to do the behavior plan a different way than what we put together as a school, and also to use different materials. And I said, what? Tell me more. And went over. What was happening was an outside provider, third-party provider, the student had autism, this was a third-party provider, was coming into the school, had set up a time, and was coming in and working with the student one-on-one in a pull-out area, and doing whatever therapy plan that they had, and then also was kind of dictating to the classroom teacher, who was excellent, on what to do to support the student. There were a number of red flags immediately. I had no idea that that was going on. So I contacted the provider and said, you cannot come back and do that here. There's one is liability. What if something happened where there was an accusation between the, students said something, that the provider did. Second, we have the right to select methodology and to do instruction. Third, liability, what happens to the provider if they slip and fall on our property. And there's just so many things that went into that, and it's detailed out in the article. That was tricky though, because the parents are really mad at me for not allowing this person who they thought was wonderful and actually, was very, very thorough. It just was not appropriate to have that person come in and supplant that child's educational time. But it was convenient for that person to do that instead of just seeing that child after school or in the evening. So please, be well aware of those situations in your school, and if anything like that is happening for someone to come in, if they request to come in and to do that, treatment or see a student in the school, make sure that anything like that runs through you. An observation, yeah, I was always fine with that as long as the parent knew about it and that the child and that person were never alone. There was always somebody there. Maybe a couple observations, but not that a person comes in and observes for 10 weeks in a row. And what schools are doing now is they are inviting mental health providers into the school to actually provide services on site. That process happens through written agreements. Hudson, Kaukauna, Kimberly are some districts that have been doing that. Adams Friendship is a district that's doing that. And that's growing more and more just because of the needs of kids. And first of all, access to resources, parents saying, either they couldn't afford the resources or that, providers were so far away that if they had to take their child out of school and drive an hour to a provider and then drive back, well, they probably weren't going to do that. If they took the child out, the child would be gone for the day. So they, working with the provider, the school would actually give that provider, time where they could be in the school. It gets tricky. You'd have to go through and maybe contact one of those districts that I mentioned and again, talk to your school attorney or business manager, because making sure that that is a fair process so you're not favoring, certain agencies, and that you'd have a request for proposal, certain things that you would have built into that, whether you're paying for the services or whether the services are being paid for, through the county, or whether they're being paid for by the parents' insurance, but yet being provided at the school. That gets kind of complicated. But I never thought I'd see the day that we'd have mental health providers coming into schools, but that day is here. So read that article and just be sure that if you do get into agreements like that, that you do have that on very sound legal footing. And just because maybe an autism line worker comes in and says, I'm going to come in, work with the child, or I'll be in the classroom working, with you. First of all, we have background checks. The line workers change a lot, so you have to be aware of that. But again, you have the right to select methodology. That school time is your time, and then it's globally as a school if you're going to make a decision regarding, mental health services and whether or not you're going to work with some partnership to have those provided on site. So that's all I have for week 1, and I hope it's been a good week for you, and that again you've had your bio posted and you get your discussion questions in by Thursday. So thank you.